Hello, now I'd like to talk about the differences between a 2D and a 3D world. And I think, and this is all speculation on my part, but I think to some extent, if your game is about navigation, your game is just about exploration, I think people respond to it a lot better if it's in 3D than if it's in 2D. And I think this is sort of an interesting thing to consider, and something to think about, for your projects or for our future projects, because a lot of people said, oh, Neverending Nightmares is boring, there's nothing to do, you're just walking, and while I think that's true, I think, well, I wouldn't say there's not I guess I'm not willing to exactly concede on that point, but there's definitely a lot of walking, and I think it's less about what you're doing than what you're experiencing. But if you compare that to other, like, 3D exploration games, I think there's a little bit of a difference, and I think people respond to it better. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is also with the art. I think another thing is people notice the art less in a 3D world, which I think gives you some extra forgiveness points on reuse. So, like, for example, I always talk about Fatal Frame 1 and Gone Home and how, they got away with, or Amnesia, with having limited art assets, but still games that people really enjoyed. And Neverending Nightmare, certainly we were limited on our game assets, maybe we reused, our things more, but I think, because of the, fixed camera, you're looking at exactly the same image, and it's clear it's exactly the same image. Whereas if you're doing a 3D game, and of course we did our own lighting system, but with a 3D game you can change the, color of the lights, which I guess maybe the black and white thing also makes, things look a little more samey, but, you can do tricks with lighting, you can reuse a wall texture, or, reuse things, and people don't quite feel like it's just a rehash. And of course, I think we drew extra flack on it because we deliberately tried to play with your expectations. And part of this was because I talked to Davey Rendon. Is that? I apologize, Davey, if I'm mispronouncing your last name. And, he was saying that one of the things that people responded best to in the Stanley Parable is when they expected the world to be a certain way, because you sort of start at the same place, and then it behaves a little differently. And so I thought that was really good advice, and we tried to do that in Neverending Nightmares. And, I mean, obviously it's difficult to make a game as good as the Stanley Parable, and it's difficult to use that exactly, but I think to some extent, right, in the sections that we sort of pulled almost exactly from the previous, levels, it didn't have quite the same impact, just because of the way the game was structured, and it wasn't, like, funny or entertaining exactly. The sections were the same, and also, I mean, I think, people didn't quite notice that things were exactly the same or very similar, versus just because all of our art looks somewhat similar because of the black and white art style. And while I think, with the themes of OCD, I think reusing the content made sense, and I did want it to feel almost like a time loop, like a nightmare that you kept having but you couldn't break out no matter what you did, and that's sort of partly inspired by some actual nightmares I had that led into the creation of the game. But I guess getting back to specifically 3D versus 2D, I think, yeah, you don't notice the individual art assets because you're always kind of looking around, and I think that sort of 3D, sort of first-person free roaming camera is really good for that, because you can look at all sorts of different things, and you never sort of fixate on one particular asset. It's more about the movement in the experience. Now, the flip side is that if you're doing a first-person character, you don't get to see the character's expressions, which I think is something I really like about Neverending Nightmares. Now, arguably, the character doesn't have a lot of expressions, and certainly that's true, and to some extent, it's deliberate that he doesn't react to a lot of these grotesque scenes of horror, because we wanted the character to be almost enigmatic, sort of a silent protagonist. Obviously talks, but that sort of thing where you project yourself onto him. That being said, he still blinks and looks around nervously, and I really like the wince when he steps on the glass. We want to make sure you felt that that was painful and also self-destructive, because self-destruction is a huge theme in Neverending Nightmares. So, I guess I talked about the art aspects, and now I can go back to what I was originally saying was about navigation. And so, in a 3D environment, let's say you're playing on the gamepad, you're using 2 sticks, and you're looking around and moving around and strafing, and it's interesting if you saw like Paul Marlecki's talk at Steam Dev Days, where he demonstrated how unrealistic the movement is in first-person games, but and it doesn't work for VR was his point. But I think that's giving you something to do, right? Both of your thumbs are occupied, and so walking feels less like you're on a train or something, unless it's the beginning of Half-Life, where you're actually on a train. But because I think Neverending Nightmares is to some extent linear. I mean, obviously we have the branching paths, but mostly the world, there's one correct way to get from the beginning to the end. There's a couple rooms that don't that aren't on the path. And some people have actually criticized that, which I think is a difficult one, because I think it makes the world feel more realistic, right? It's not just a linear path, and also, again, it has some dead ends, has some spice to the, essentially linear journey. But, I mean, I guess they feel like they were a waste of time, and I don't know really what to do about that. So I'm not going to cover that in this episode. Getting back to what I was saying is that, people are doing things and have this control, but then you can't, show the character's face, and there's certainly downsides. But I think fundamentally, the navigation feels better when you're not just holding like one direction always, which is what Neverending Nightmares is structured. There's a lot of movement from left to right, and so I think that can almost give people this haunted house, not like an actual haunted house, but like, it's around Halloween, hey, we're going to set up a haunted house, where you're just being pulled through an experience, or just walking through an experience. I think just that sort of left to right movement. And I think that's something difficult, is that getting around the left to right movement with a 2D game. And certainly Lone Survivor, I think, did a fairly good job, because they had a map, and so you felt like you were moving around a 3D space because the map told you. I mean, I had to check the map a lot because I didn't have a good 2D to 3D understanding, and I think in general, I think it's tough to navigate around a game without a map. Certainly playing Borderlands, the pre-sequel, a lot with my wife, and the map is like woefully inadequate. It's always been a bit challenging in Borderlands, but this game, it seems, there's even more verticality, so the map seems even less adequate to explain, where you are and how to get to where you want to go. So, I mean, the 3D aspect, hopefully, I guess, sort of, sorry, changing gears, with Borderlands, if the map were just simple and it was like, Doom, where you couldn't have things over other things, then I think that navigating around the world would be less interesting, but it would be easier, and I think there's always a trade-off, and certainly I'm not thrilled about using a map in our game, especially because it doesn't make sense for a horror game, and in Penumbra they did interesting things where there was a physical map in the world and you could look at it. Maybe we'll do something like that. Maybe we won't have a map, but I don't know, it seems like 3D does solve some problems, but creates some other ones. So, I don't know, just a little thoughts on that.